Our next panel on Belonging Economies will be moderated by the one and only Wendy Ake. She's the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute's Public Finance Program. Something people may not know about Wendy, she says that becoming a physicist who can teach you about quantum mechanics and entanglement is what drove her to become an activist, including living and working in Palestine. Sounds like there's a story there if you see her in the halls. And so now, without further ado, Wendy Ake, and she's going to introduce her panel. Welcome, Wendy.
Happy to be joined by two virtuosos, if we're keeping the metaphor. Jovan Scott Lewis is here, professor in geography at UC Berkeley. Geography is an amazing field, not just maps, fortunately. So a little advert for that as a potential major. He's also with Othering and Belonging Institute as one of the faculty members. And most recently, relative to why we're here, was the chair of the California Reparations Task Force. Yeah, absolutely. That report was released last June. I would really encourage everyone to read the report, but also pull up the testimony. All of that is located online. So yeah, definitely look at it if you haven't already. Also, we have Amaka, who's with us. She's the CEO of Katali Foundation. Yes. Agreed. She's also the director there of the Restorative Economics Group, which is a framework that she worked on before Katali and her extensive consulting career, talking to foundations and working with a lot of folks on what that means and how to implement it. So we'll talk about that quite a bit today. Nick Tilson has an illness. So hopefully he was going to be here today. That ended up not being able to happen. He's just wanted to say a bit about what they do. He's the CEO and president of NDN Collective. Absolutely agreed. And at that collective, in case you don't know, they do a lot of work on lending programs for the community. If you're a funder, I would encourage you to look up Indian Collective in detail. They do power building work, storytelling, and most notably a land back campaign that they run. So definitely look into that if you don't know already. Ask other people as you're out what that is, what the details are of that. And then also he has a lot of talks and interviews he's done on YouTube you can look up. I encourage you to learn as much as you can about that. I also have some asthma flare-up, so apologies for that in advance. When people talk about economics, sometimes it's discussed in the most simplest of terms as if it's gravity, coming from a physics background. But it's obviously not. That's actually an ideology in and of itself. So when we talk about economics and thinking about belonging economics, we have to talk about these abstract ideas that we have to talk about if we're talking about place building, general principles. So we do need to think about these big ideas, abstractions, ideology, how it should play a role, what role. But again, it's in the spirit of placemaking. So we can think about what that looks like. Today is the 10-year anniversary of Flint deciding to turn its water from Lake Huron, source where there's 20% of the globe's fresh water in the Great Lakes. They switched from that, which was the Detroit water system, to the Flint River, which had been polluted since 1940s, since the Industrial Revolution, from GM, from other chemical manufacturers, from agriculture. GM switched. This is all placemaking of othering economies. Lead poisoning was happening since 1940. When the last major piece of legislation with two others was in 1970s, for example, with the Clean Water Act, GM and other companies, again, placemaking, increased costs of labor from the labor movement response. A lot of corporations moved south and east. GM was one of them. Being able to meet EPA regulations was too expensive. They moved, leaving a legacy of contaminated Flint River. When that source moved, we have poisoned, toxic water, children who have been affected by this. This is what we mean by placemaking. Flint Rising is a group that's trying to remake place, and that's what we're talking about with belonging economies, which placemaking we can do to switch this. Moving to our wonderful panelists, I wanted to start asking first, we've talked about belonging as having 4 components: agency, inclusion, recognition, connection. How do you translate those into economies? We're saying that in a plural way. What does that look like? I'll scoot back.
You gonna make me go first? Cool, I'll go for it.
Rock, paper, scissors.
Hey. So let me start off by saying just thank you everybody for being here this afternoon. To identify myself, my name's Amaka Agbo. I am a dark-skinned black woman with lots of piercings, gold accessories, and I'm wearing a white dress. So to your question around how we think about economies as it relates to belongings, I'd love to back into it by sharing a story. Because you opened up with talking about the study of economy being about ideology. And, you know, when I went back to graduate school, and some of you have heard this story, one of the first things that I learned in my macroeconomics course when I opened up that book, the opening paragraph described the study of economy as being about who gets to decide who eats caviar and who eats potatoes. Who gets to decide who takes the public transportation and who drives a Porsche. And so when we think about economies of belonging, the question of who is the person that is deciding and what happens to those that are left with the public transportation that might not work or just the potatoes that don't provide enough nutrients. I think part of what we're calling into question is what does it look like to create an economy that's deeply inclusive? One of the things that I've learned recently that has been really illuminating to me is I've developed so much gratitude for the disability justice movement. The disability justice movement, particularly, yes, please, a huge round of applause. Although they have been organizing for decades, it was during the pandemic that I think many of us that were forced to be isolated and siloed into our homes began to understand what does it look like to set up structures and practices that are deeply inclusive so that everybody can belong, so that everybody can participate. And so I think that kind of lifts up what the opportunity is before us. When we look at the basic needs that everyone has a right to, whether it's housing, healthcare, education, access to safe and healthy food, we could look at it through a disability justice lens. A story that Angela Glover Blackwell, the founder of PolicyLink, tells is that when we first passed the American Disability Act, one of the first things that happened is that they went around to communities and cut the curbs out of sidewalks. And in doing so, not only did they make it easier for people who were in wheelchairs to get up and out of the sidewalk, but people who were pushing strollers, riding skateboards, roller skating, and bicycling. And so when we take the intention of being deeply inclusive, when we take a disability justice lens and start to really ask the questions of who's making the decisions, who is benefiting, and who is being burdened, we can start to answer some of the questions of how we can actually begin to set up an economy of deep belonging. And I would offer, when we think about an economy of deep belonging, we're actually thinking about a deeply caring economy.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. It's really an honor. I've been here today since this morning, and it's been a wonderful environment of community and belonging. And I think the question of belonging economies is an important one, because it is true, that we are thinking about the matter of distribution. And in that textbook definition, that is honestly the primary preoccupation with what we think about in terms of the other processes of the economy, like exchange, etc. But I've mentioned exchange because my study of the economy comes from economic anthropology. And when we think about what economy means in those terms, what we understand economy to be is a mode of relational building. So the truth is that all economic practice is community practice. The problem is that we have been very exclusive in determining what communities we have these relations within. So when we think about exchange, the foundational principle of exchange is what we would think of as reciprocity. Right? I am producing, you are consuming. That is a relational process. The simple circulation of goods is a relational process. And so that leads us to thinking about things like the market, right, as one other way of thinking about the economy, which is how a lot of us in lay terms think about the economy today. However, when we think about belonging, what I believe we need to do is, in thinking about these relations, is how do we open up the scope of those relations? How do we understand and widen the definition of belonging within? Because the point that I'm making is that belonging is already inherently involved in economic practice, but it is an economic practice that is situated within very restricted and very exclusive terms. And so I think when we open up that question, then we have something there. And what makes me so, I think, optimistic is that inherent in economic practice already are some of the very values, right? We think about corporations, right? We think about these various modes of collectivity that currently exist in almost every single economic, framework that we think of, turning on the news or, in our households. Who's going to pay what, right? To what benefit will these funds go to? And so economic thinking is inherently relational thinking, and therefore it is always available for a kind of politics of belonging. The issue is that we have to change those politics, and I think, so what Amaka is saying is exactly right. How do we open up the scope? And I think that's the beginning of the conversation that we have to have, that I've seen taking place, in this conference.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to then say both of your work touches on reparations. How does that impact economies of belonging? Are you thinking of that? And also your work.
Okay. All right. Reparations. We have many definitions, practically speaking. Reparations as a mode of producing repair, meaning something is harmed or broken or injured. Reparations is a means of fixing that which is repaired. I think in relationship to the conversation here, we tend to think of reparations, and I think a lot of the public think of reparations as a form of compensation. And so the kind of compensatory form of reparations is oftentimes the problem with the question of reparations in the public discourse. And that has everything to do with the first question, right? To whom do we believe, right, we owe, right, a kind of incorporation, a kind of belonging, not only into our political systems, but our economic systems? And so with reparations, we are asking that question. So for 2 years, as you noted, I worked on the California Reparations Task Force, and my portfolio was looking into how do we compensate for the harms African Americans have faced in this state. And one of the things that was really fascinating is that I think the kind of conventional means into going into that question was to say, well, what were the injuries? What did African Americans lose? And we very dutifully detailed in about 5 key areas all of the economic losses to the African American community in this state. And as we were going through that process, it dawned on me that this is in fact a relational process as well. Meaning we're thinking of losses but not of gains, right? And the millions of dollars that African Americans lost due to housing discrimination were in fact economic gains, right, to the state and to private entities who benefited from the neighborhood dispossession of African American communities through the uneven and predatory loans that African Americans were given access to, if they were given access to. And so reparations is in a way, bless you, is in a way a way of re-asking the question about this kind of model of distribution by first giving an accounting of not just what some communities lost, but how did other communities benefit. And in asking that question of this kind of loss and benefit, analysis, we actually do get to something of a kind of relational sense of economy again. Meaning, for a predominantly white neighborhood to develop, right? For a predominantly white banking system to develop. For the development of the suburbs as not just as a unit of where people live, but as a unit that helps to encourage, certain economic activities, labor activities, and so forth. We do know that there were some investments made into those processes, and that African American communities were, in fact, on the giving side of those investments. And so reparations for me has very much been about asking this question of what are the relationships between African Americans and broader society. And my hope, I guess, is that once that broader society begins to understand exactly what African Americans have contributed, what they have been forced to contribute, then reparations becomes a necessary and obvious form, not just of repair or redress, but of, in fact, making the entire society whole. I work at UC Berkeley, and thank you. And we think about the history of racial discrimination in higher education, where African Americans were simply not allowed to go to university. They weren't given access. But we know that the UC system was a public university. But how perverse is it to recognize that African Americans, as taxpayers, were funding the University of California system while their own families were barred from entry? Right? And so in simply recognizing that fact, as human beings, reparations is a non-issue. Reparations is simply a just act. And so that's my way into the question of reparations and repair.
I'm going to see what I can add to that. But what I appreciate about where you ended is really this piece of lifting up how Black people in this country have contributed to what we currently get to benefit from today. And so my work on restorative economics specifically is informed by my long-term organizing work here in the Bay Area, doing community organizing work, doing policy advocacy work. And one of the things that I recognized early on is that so many of the campaigns that I was leading and running was about turning community members out to push back against the forces that were shaping their neighborhoods, and wanting to ensure that communities actually had an opportunity to not just vision what they wanted for themselves, but to be able to articulate it, implement it, and build it for themselves. And so restorative economics, the shorthand of the framework is that at the Katali Foundation, we support community-owned and community-governed projects. And we prioritize the redistribution of our resources into Black, Indigenous, and all community of color projects to build their political, economic, and cultural power. That is important to us because we believe that we actually cannot get towards a more just, equitable economy. We can't get towards an economy of belonging if we continue to have economic systems, democratic systems, criminal justice systems that are intentional about excluding Black and brown people from being able to participate in the benefits of what our country has to offer. And so we must actually reinvest, restore, make those community whole so that they can be a part of the conversation around how we shape and build a more equitable world going forward. Because what was also lost was so much of our traditional Indigenous ways of being together in communities. And those are actually pieces that we need to reclaim, because that is actually how we move forward. And so when we support community-owned and governed projects, it is to ensure that we are lifting up communities to have self-determination, agency, access to the resources that they need to build beyond and better than what we have currently been experiencing in this country. And so it's not to kind of settle into the status quo of what we see, but it is to ensure that people of color who are creative, vibrant, and resilient are able to live forward, build beyond. And that is also why when we think about reparations, yes, part of the equation is definitely about compensation, making people whole. And the other part of the equation is about how are we addressing the structural harms, the systemic racism that continues to impact so many people of color. And so the ways that we invest back into those communities allows us to leapfrog past those systems so that these communities can actually have agency and self-determination.
Yeah, thank you for both of those comments. One of the questions really, I think we've cycled around here. You've talked about curb cut effect, and we're talking about these really profound issues, and curb cuts on sidewalks you're talking about as being like some way to capture some of that. The Americans with Disabilities Act, making communities whole, the way Black folks have been paying into the system that's been exclusive. Uneven distribution of resources, essentially. So at the Institute, we often talk about universal aspirations, aspirations that are very widely held, that there's a lot of agreement on as being an aspiration, and then talk about targeted strategies to get there. We often talk, as you said, about systemic changes and prioritizing that within targeted strategies. Sometimes we talk about targeted strategies that are targeted for groups of people, specific groups of people, which reparations is a part of. How do you think reparations and repair is situated within those questions around universality, targeted, and modulating between the two?
I'm going to try to keep up with you academics. I really am. Let me back into it with another story.
Yeah, thank you.
You know, I recently had the opportunity to attend a Demilitarizing Hawaii in the South Pacific campaign. I think that's my colleague Iris, yes. And so we had an opportunity to visit some of our grantees that we've been supporting. And one of our grantees is an organization called Aloha Lives Here. Aloha Lives Here is a Native community of houseless people that had been literally pushed out to the fringes of their community. And even in being excluded, they were able to create a village model where it created such a deep sense of belonging that people really valued the ability to be together as houseless people in this place. And one of the things that happened is that as they continued to be attacked and continued to be pushed further and further out to the fringes of their community, they decided they wanted to actually acquire a piece of property that they could develop where they could live together with safety and security. And so they were able to raise the funds to develop a 20-acre lot that they then developed into, or along with their vision of communal housing. And so with communal housing, they were able to really figure out how to structure the design to make it permanently affordable so that anybody who lived there would not have to pay more than $250 a month. And they did that by being able to ensure that there was shared kitchen structures, shared bathroom structures. They provide the security as community members who are governing and patrolling the space. They also provide childcare so that when people go away to work, they don't actually have to go look for their childcare. I lift this up as we think about repair and reparations in the context of targeted universalism, because what they were able to do, one, was a feat that demonstrated that Native Hawaiian people who have been excluded and who have had to suffer occupation, coming together, raising the resources that they need, and recognizing that the government was not able to meet their needs. So one of the things that happened is they applied to HUD for funding, Housing of Urban Department, or I don't know, HUD. And so so they applied to HUD, and HUD would not actually give them the funds for their development project because they would not actually permit the shared living structures, right? And so these are the ways when we think about how to make things deeply inclusive, there's so many structures, whether it's public policy financing, whether it's tax code, legal, financial, that we have to be able to overcome and re-envision in order to be able to create economies and systems that actually keep us rooted in belonging. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's a story I wanted to share. So,
Thank you. A great response and a great accounting of what it really looks like, really practical on the ground, inspirational work.
Now I don't know how to feel about the PhD, you know?
I'm just jealous, that's all.
No, listen, you know. So what's interesting is this idea of targeted universalism is really fascinating to me, because when we think about the kind of universals, you know, we have in mind, you know, what kind of rights are we talking about? What kinds of principles and ethics of access are we talking about? You know, we recognize that a lot of those principles are inherently flawed, right? So the American project, the colonial projects, right? So many of those principles of liberty, you know, and so forth need to be reimagined, but they show up in our vocabulary in all kinds of ways. So without troubling that just for a moment, because that's a whole other panel tomorrow. I don't know what the agenda is, but I like to remind people of a couple of historical facts when it comes to African Americans in this country and the narratives that we have around African American life. I like to remind people that 50 years after emancipation, that means 50 years removed from formal slavery in this country, African Americans own 14% of agricultural land in this country. I like to remind people that over a century ago, in the height of Jim Crow, right, at the height of lynching in those years immediately following the birth of a nation, there were over 100 black-owned banks in this country. And so a century later, we have like maybe a dozen, and I think Killer Mike owns half of them or something like that. with Mike Bloomberg and, you know. Listen, I could throw it back. The nonprofit space is a question, right? Like, how do you, and I wrote a book on Oklahoma and Greenwood and Black Wall Street. And what we have is a narrative, in fact, of Black life as being representative of these universals that we're not questioning for the moment, but let's for right now, American universals. What we have is a narrative of Black life as accomplishing those universals as quite exceptional. And I try to remind people that that, in fact, was not the case. So when we think about reparations, right, what we are trying to do is provide, whether compensation or whatever other forms of redress that we can discuss, to simply get African Americans back to where they already were. And when we think about that, right, then that is not just a kind of targeted universal. Because when we think about the development of white society, when we think about the development of mainstream society, right, what you have is a very targeted campaign, right, for the very precise development of a very specific community. When we think about the Homestead Act, when we think about the discriminatory effects of the GI Bill, when we think about, just last week, right, where African Americans have been found to be disproportionately impacted in lending, right, in 2024, right? When we think about that as part of the actual exception to an ongoing project of investment, of subsidization, of welfare for white American society, right? So what we have is, in fact, African Americans historically representing being able to accomplish all of those things despite. And so I think the idea here is there is a universal principle, there is a set of ethics that still are very much alive in the aspirations of African American communities. There is still a memory of what these communities were. And I think reparations is meant to simply provide the return of that, of the actual material means. Because what I'm saying is that African Americans had the economic wherewithal without reparations, without having, right, the lopsided benefit of state and federal policy. So what you have is really, in the same spirit of land back, right, you have wealth back amongst African Americans that I think we need to address through a reparative process.
Yeah, thank you. And I wonder what you all think, with your going back to stories, when you talk about the concepts you're thinking of, that's through your work been a really primary focus of yours when you're talking about restorative economies or questions that are more abstract when thinking about policy. And your work and the testimony that was so powerful and such a critical part of the committee, what is the power of encoding and making sure that those archives of the testimony or the stories of accounts that you give, what is the power of those stories, which are something that's often the most remote from economic policy? What is the power of keeping that part of the historical record and part of the instrumental strategies of making policy?
Yeah, I would say the documentation of stories are essential because so much of the way that white supremacy functions is to erase us out of history. And so our ability to continue to document and remind ourselves to ourselves who we are, what we are capable of, is critical. As an organizer, part of what I observe sometimes can be the challenge for people to have the freedom and space to imagine. And what I have learned is that through deep listening and being in relationship with people, sometimes it's not about imagining something in your head. Sometimes it is actually inviting people to recall the ways that they have seen their families and friends and community be in relationship with one another, and being able to connect that, their experiences, to what we are trying to build by showing them we have had this before, right? And so when we lift up Black Wall Street, when we lift up all the different structures and the ways that Black and brown people have been living in community, have been supporting one another, by showing them this is something that we have had. It was just stolen from us, it was taken from us, and they continue to try to erase it so that we can't build it. It helps people to understand what is actually possible going forward. So I think documentation, storytelling is important. And oftentimes the qualitative stories don't get the same weight that the quantitative metrics can sometimes get. And so our ability to really balance both, right? Balance the impact stories with the impact metrics, to really have the data to inform then what is our strategy going forward. That is our work as we're trying to build something more just and equitable.
Yeah, let me just ask a follow-up to that. We have a lot of funders in the audience. We have even more grantees in the audience. And you have a great background, and right now your practice is in philanthropy. What are some of the dynamics around making stories part of the goal of projects, or how they're assessed?
Yeah, I think, philanthropy is interesting because as a sector, we have a desire to center ourselves always. And we really want to counteract that with the work that we do at Kitali. Rather, where I have been steadfastly trained by our Director of Communications, Zainab Mohammed, is to really figure out how we lift up the work and stories of our grantees. Our work as a funder is to be in service to our grantees. It's to leverage and use our platform and our power to ensure that those that are doing the work on the ground at frontline communities are able to talk about their needs, their wins, their victories, their challenges. And it might be that through that, they may end up lifting up how they've been in partnership with Kitali or what they might have learned through us. But it is actually most essential and important that we as a funder put them front and center. It's also important for us as a foundation because we're spending out. We have no intention of being here for forever. We don't think that we should, particularly because of the way we accumulated our wealth. And so when we end up centering ourselves all the time and then we close down, people can think that it creates a vacuum as a spend out foundation. What we are really clear about is that we are not creating a vacuum in spending out. What we are actually doing is redistributing our resources so that these projects can be the ones that grow and continue to fill this space. So that's how we think about our work as a funder.
An archive of projects. Yeah, that's great. And turn it to you.
You've restored my faith in the... Listen. Tulsa, Oklahoma. Okay. Tulsa, Oklahoma. Yeah, So I get to Tulsa, Oklahoma in 2014 as part of, I won't tell you why I showed up in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 2014, but I was there. And I'm originally from Jamaica, and it struck me, okay, all right. And when I got to North Tulsa specifically, which is the area that historically is still Greenwood, but was known as the Greenwood, and with Black Wall Street, what I saw in 2014 was something that was eerily reminiscent of poor communities in Jamaica, where in Jamaica, a lot of NGOs, a lot of nonprofits were providing everyday services to people. And the same thing was happening right here in the American heartland. And it was really striking because of this history of Greenwood as Black Wall Street, and when we say Black Wall Street, the moniker kind of has its own mythos, but what we meant, what we mean by what Greenwood looked like as a Black Wall Street was simply a community of healthy economic activity. There were banks, there were schools, there were ice cream parlors and roller skating rinks, normalish things. And in 2014, there was a fight for a grocery store to be in this community. All of the education had basically been outsourced to the nonprofit sector. The healthcare had been outsourced to the nonprofit sector. Many years later, a grocery store finally came to North Tulsa, and the list of funders, right, was almost encyclopedic. Like everybody threw in, it seemed, just to simply provide a grocery store. So we have the nonprofit sector providing groceries, healthcare, education. The historian, Guyanese historian Walter Rodney would designate that as an underdeveloped space in which a community is entirely dependent on external sources for its very existence. And what was really frustrating is that as we got to the centenary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, all of the kind of attention was focused on the history of harm in that place. And so what really, again, perversely, a lot of philanthropies were investing in this narrative of harm, right? And investing in a narrative that erased people from that very geography, because there were actual living people on Greenwood Avenue today, right? There's public housing in North Tulsa on Greenwood Avenue, but the narrative was this place was decimated, right? Everyone died. And so we have to, right, fundraise, we have to. And I think what you saw was a kind of narrative of giving, but one that produced and reproduced a cycle of dependency, where the state then was given, right, the freedom to not invest, right? The state was given an out. And so what you have was, in fact, the time limits. Because I love the fact that you don't want to exist for forever. I love the fact that you are saying self-determination, because these were the very things that were missing in this context. And so I think, to answer the question is that it's about these narratives, absolutely. It's about how they erase people actually living in North Tulsa on Greenwood Avenue. But it's also how some narratives get celebrated and they get made to become exceptional narratives, which themselves become very limiting and almost suffocating to people. Because then what you have still today in North Tulsa, but what you had at that moment was an entire economy built around this narrative of harm, where all the residents of Greenwood could be, all the black residents of North Tulsa could be, were people who were harmed. And then how do you ever become anything else, right? And so that's it, So but you have restored my faith. Yes, Fab, indeed.
So we do have Q&A. There's folks who will choose, or I guess I will choose from the three levels of the auditorium.
So I don't have a super direct question, but I think there is a couple of just like titherings as I'm thinking through what you're speaking about, especially as we're thinking through reparations. I think especially as we're thinking about the American project, right? I think there's often times that people it feels like we can get really wrapped up in there was a really helpful graphic up here in terms of like how we move from like exclusion to inclusion to belonging, right? And so there's definitely pieces of this that I resonate in terms of a return to a type of economic affordability that was afforded to Black Americans at some point, but that is also in a particular context, right? Like that is also still very much in an anti-Black context in which people are able to garner that power. And it's also in a very anti-Indigenous context as well. And so I think sometimes the issue that I have with reparations is that it doesn't also advocate for the ending of the American project, but rather an inclusion into the American project. And so is there a way that we can kind of reconcile or think about reparations that is more tactile. I just think that sometimes we talk, I have a hard time just because I'm like, the things that have been taken from Black Americans are not actually repayable. Like no dollar amount will actually be able to give back what has been stolen. And so when we're at an odds where it is actually an impayable debt, something that you can never pay back with any dollar amount, right? Then what is the conversation that reparations actually holds in a movement? Or is there a way that we can talk about it more as tactic to another means rather than a means in and of itself? Like, I personally don't think I will ever be made whole by any amount of money. I don't know if Black communities will be made whole by a dollar amount that is created through the American economy, which in itself is anti-Indigenous and anti-Black.
I agree with you, but the fact remains that African Americans are owed. And I think that when we think about the relationship between reparations and repair, we should think of them as separate projects. And the capacity to feel repair, to become whole, is actually a project for African American community members themselves. The state cannot repair you, but the state owes you. And so the question is, right, in this moment of reparation, meaning the compensation, it is for community members, if they want to be community members, how they choose to be community members, to then decide. You know, I like to think about Black political projects comparatively. So what we do know is that prior to the 1950s, 1960s, what you had was global Black solidarity as a set of various movements where Black peoples across the world recognized that they were being respectively, right, discriminated against, murdered, right, by various colonial powers. What happened is that in places like West Africa, in the Caribbean, those movements became state projects. And because they became state projects, those Black populations were able to ask themselves who they were and who they wanted to be. And I'm not very happy with all of the answers, right? But it was a question that they were able to ask. African Americans, however, through the project of civil rights, got incorporation, inclusion, which is why we need better terms, right? And in that, they were given an answer, effectively, of who they were and who they wanted to be, which was an answer defined by this American project that you note. So reparations, right, is in fact the payments for the losses, for the harms. And I do want to push back on this incalculability myth. I spent 2 years of my life calculating those losses. And I say that because it's important to understand that that is one of the reasons why this particular community has long been denied compensation. It's unpayable. No, it's not. You don't want to pay it. That's why it's unpayable. But from reparations, right? Reparations is a starting point. Reparations as a mode of compensation, of redress, right? And we can have a long debate about compensation through direct cash or whatever. But the project of repair is a project for African Americans to pursue on their own terms. Now, what reparations as a mode of compensation does is it provides some material wherewithal to make a set of choices. Because what we do know is that reparations to African Americans as school choice is not the same thing as white Americans or whomever having the capital to make those choices for themselves. Right? That can't be. So what we're saying is that the capacity to make certain collective or individual choices in this current system requires a certain amount of material wherewithal. Now, the American project, you know, and dismantling it, listen, I'm from Jamaica, so that's not my concern, right? I'm joking, but But that is a question that has to be brought back to the community, because you absolutely do have African Americans who very much love the American project, and you all have to work that out, right? But I think reparations and repair should be seen as separate endeavors. And reparations are what the state and all of the various parties to African American injury owe black people. It's owed. Simple as that. Repair, something you do with your people, and you get where you want to go, right? Based upon that collective determination.
Can I just ask my question? Hi, my name is Catherine Nwajaku Dahu, and I'm from many places, but from London in particular. Thank you so much for a fantastic conversation. My question, first of all, I'll make a little comment and then a question. My little comment was just to echo what you said about the importance of quantifying reparations, because it will always be an approximation. But in cases of law, for example, when harm is done, a lawyer will go through and quantify what injury looks like financially. And of course, if you have had your arm severed, it will never bring back your arm. But symbolically, it demonstrates that there is acknowledgement of wrong. And that's really important. And I think it's really important to this whole conversation, the importance of symbolic acknowledgement of harm. That's the comment. And I say that because I did a lot of work on environmental justice in Nigeria and spent a lot of time trying to quantify what clean up for pollution damage looked like. And it was always an approximation, but it's quite good to put a number on it. The question I had was really about the substance of this conference, which is about belonging without othering and the underlying ambition to work towards bridging. And whilst I was delighted by the way you both approached the question of economy, belonging economies, in this, give and take way. It's always about exchange. If one group is denied, the other gains, and so on. I was just wondering how you articulate that in a way that brings others along. So those who would see themselves as not being, not directly concerned by reparations, or who are not African American, but who we need also to bring along. So the question really is about how you communicate the value of this project that's enriching to all, and that is necessary for all to feel whole. That's really the question. Thanks.
I'm a little nervous to give my answer, but I'm just gonna go for it. I would say the way I personally approach it, and the work that I do, I don't approach it by centering those people that I'm trying to bring along. I approach it by centering the communities that have the need, the communities that are doing the work on the ground. And I do that because what I have observed is that people want to be in deep connection. People want to be in community and relationship with one another. And the projects that we end up supporting end up attracting those others that otherwise might be detractors, right? That might be disruptors. There are people that will even try to stop those projects and intervene on them. And one of the beautiful things, going back to the story around the organization Aloha Lives here in Hawaii, one of the things that they ended up doing is those people that were saying, you cannot actually set up your community in our neighborhood, they went out and invited them in. right? They went and built the bridges so that they could get to know individuals, know the children, see how the space was going to be developed. They didn't center them. They didn't stop doing their work. They did not make their work about the other expats that had moved to Hawaii. They continued to center their native community. But by doing so, they were able to show others that there's a different way for us to be in relationship with each other. You know, what we know about, we could talk about Black culture. People love Black culture. They want to be a part of it. And if we are able to figure out how to move a belonging economy into a more popular culture way of thinking about resources, it will inherently attract people. But I do not center them in the work that I do.
Very well said. I think, a part of the issue is moving away from the ability to deny the fact that we are all in relation. And the truth is that, whether we call it white supremacy or whatever we call it, is that thing, the American project, has allowed itself to both create and reproduce itself on a narrative of individuality, right? There is no collectivity in that model. In fact, the very notion of whiteness as a subject form is that of an individual. We talk about individual rights. We do not have a kind of framework for collectivity. So in a way, what you're proposing is almost impossible without a complete reorientation of a collective ethics. And so, like Amaka is saying, you cannot do that, because that is a fool's errand in a way, right? You are going to waste so much resource, so much time trying to convince people. In the task force, we produced an 1,100-page final report that charts the harms against African Americans. Young people call it the receipts, right? From 1850, and I like to joke, from 1850 to last week, right? And still, you could present, and the thing weighs bloody near 5 pounds, right? Like the report, it's immense. And you could still throw that at the feet of somebody, and they will say, well, that's not about me, right? And I'm saying, but yes, you ride BART every day, don't you, to go to your job in the city? Do you know that the Black community of South Berkeley was raised to build Ashby BART station? That is you, right? Well, no, that's not me. So the truth is that it is them. And so you have to do, there's I like to go back to Kwame Ture on his meditation on the Civil Rights Act. And he said, civil rights weren't for Black people. Civil rights are for white people, to remind them of my humanity as a Black person. To remind them, to let them know that it's okay for me to exist in certain places. And so, yeah, some people, not me, have some work to do, And meanwhile, me and Sister here, we're just gonna go build and go do the work, And when they're ready, we'll be busy at work. And I think that's all we can do.
We have third floor.
Hello, hi. So my question is more geared towards Katali. And I'm wondering, how do you reconcile your role as a funder within the larger context of the nonprofit industrial complex, where nonprofits are positioned in competition against each other for the same resources and same belonging economies that we've been talking about, and within that, the many disparities that exist between executives and the workers of color and community-based workers that sustain the work, but also too, and more importantly, the very nature of nonprofits existing based on harm narratives and on the system being the way that it is for nonprofits to still exist. So I'm curious, ultimately, and this might be a leading question, so I'm sorry, but is philanthropy in and of itself hindering transformative justice, where we might strive for abolition, where we might strive to change, disrupt, abolish the very conditions that have us existing in the way that we do?
I like it. Yeah, you know, this is my first job in philanthropy. It'll probably be my last. You know, I come to this work, and I should say it'll probably be my last because we have a very rare and unique opportunity at Katali. I mean, we have an organization where our board members recognized they inherited wealth that actually belonged out in the community. So they came together to create an institution to redistribute those resources out into community. And so, you know, I'm going to try not to bore you all with the details, but so many of the ways that philanthropy exists into perpetuity is being able to invest our assets on Wall Street, right? That's how you have foundations that are around for hundreds of years, generation after generation. And so what we get to do at Katali Foundation is, one, we get to really challenge our investment strategy to not be on Wall Street where we're extracting value out of workers working in corporations in order to generate returns. Instead, we're able to create an investment strategy that looks at placing our assets into cooperativas in Puerto Rico, into CDFIs that support Black and brown communities, into the very community-based projects that are also our grantees through our Restorative Economies Fund. And so when we talk about the structural changes to a belonging economy, we recognize our financial instruments need to change. You also kind of spoke to the ways that the nonprofit industrial complex philanthropy can end up pitting nonprofits against each other. We work really hard not to do that. We fund it through an ecosystem approach. So when we are resourcing our grantees, we will oftentimes ask them, who else do we need to resource in order for you to be successful, in order for you to thrive? And so that's why we can fund organizations like the Black Cultural Zone, alongside organizations like Restore Oakland, alongside organizations like Artists in Response, alongside organizations like Wakanda, right? Because we understand that they're all working at an ecosystem level to ensure that Black and brown communities have what we need. I appreciate the question because you were asking me to wrestle with publicly what it means for me to be a Black woman running a foundation with anti-capitalist values, committed to Black liberation, and be able to sleep at night. And what I would say is that we are all living in a capitalist system, and our work is to figure out how we navigate the contradictions of what we are living in while knowing that we are trying to build beyond and outside of, and not because we are better than anybody else.
Just drop the mic.
You win.
Y'all, don't give me a microphone. You really shouldn't. But the last piece I'll say is what you are inviting me to state publicly, and what I would offer to all of us, is this work of belonging and how we navigate the messed up systems that we are within is by also recognizing we internalize them. This work is about deeply transforming ourselves as individuals. There's a question of, can I be the person that I need to be today in order to live into the world that I'm trying to build for tomorrow?
Now we're really gonna go. And we can't come back. So thank you so much for coming back.